Thank you, everybody, for joining today. First of all, I just want to run us through a couple of things before I introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Elwood. So if I'm just going to mention the process for obtaining CE credits from ASHA, from APA, NASP, and AOTA. So as Sherry mentioned at the top of the hour, you were resent the invitation, and this was also sent to you about 24 hours ago. This has the forms required for for ASHA CE credits. In order to, sorry, I'm just moving the slide along, sorry. Bear with me a second. In order to gain ASHA CE credits, you do need to complete the forms that were attached to that invitation, and you need to mail those, do not email them, but mail them back to Darlene Davis, and the details are on your screen and are on the forms as well. They have to be mailed back no later than August 30th to Darlene Davis, and the details are on the screen. For AOTA, NASP, and APA, again, this time you can email the forms, and these are the evaluation forms that we require. Again, these are in the invitation that was sent to you, and these need to be emailed back no later than 8:30, so that's August 30th. I will repeat these again at the end of the session for those who have joined late. I should also remind you as well that you need to attend the entire webinar to receive the CE credits. So, on that note, just one other housekeeping point. I will be answering questions throughout the presentations via the chat. If they're simple, quick questions, so will Sherry. And then we'll have a short Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And so if you have questions for Dr. Elwood, I will read those out at the end, and we'll attempt to address all of them. If we don't get through all of them, we will make sure that we get responses to you individually after the webinar. So on that note, I would just like to give a brief introduction to our presenter today, Dr. Glenn Elwood. Dr. Elwood is a Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics and Psychiatry at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, and served as the Chief of the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics and Psychology for many years. He is a fellow in no less than 6 divisions of the American Psychological Association, and is board certified in clinical psychology and clinical child and adolescent psychology. He has served on numerous committees and executive boards with APA, with the Society for Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, and with the American Academy for Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine. Dr. Elwood is a past president of the Society of Pediatric Psychology, which is Division 54 of APA, and the Society of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, excuse me. He also served on the board of directors of the American Academy for Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine, and has been associate editor of the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics since 2003. Dr. Elwood has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, chapters, abstracts, and reviews, including the Bayley Infant Neuropsychological Screening Test, which is a test that's been out for some years, but also the new Bayley-4 and the Bayley-4 Screening Test, which are publishing this year. So on that note, I will pass you over to Dr. Elwood.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you had the time to participate in this webinar. There's a disclosure form, as you can see there, and basically because I am the author of the Bayley-4 and hope to receive royalties for the test, so I want to state that up front. Now, the objectives of today's presentation are listed in front of you. It basically describe the rationale for inclusion and deployment of validity studies in the Bayley-4. I'm going to list a variety of clinical groups and show you how they compare to matched controls, and we will discuss how this information can be applied in other situations. Let's talk about validity. Now, tests per se are not valid or invalid. It is rather how the test scores are used. And there's 3 primary ways to determine how validity is established. First is to compare the test to extant measures. I'm going to do that briefly today, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is number 2, which is compared normative group data to specified clinical groups. We have 9 clinical groups that we have collected data on, and their matched controls. The total number is about 410 children. The third area is something we're not going to discuss today, and that is validate the normative sample with the current population. Now, I just want to let you know that we base our data collection for the Bayley-4 on the most recent census data. And that includes the area of the country, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West, parent education, ethnicity, and so on. So it is a very representative group. First, let me show you the Bayley-3 and Bayley-4 comparison. It were 184 children, and basically, as you can see here, there's 1 point difference in cognitive, 0.5 difference in language, and 1.3 points difference in motor functioning. So basically, what this suggests is that the Bayley-3 and the Bayley-4 are quite comparable. And this is a bit perplexing given that the Bayley-4 is quite different in terms of scoring. There's polynomous scoring, meaning 0, 1, and 2. And there is caregiver report, and there are different items. So
Dr. Elwood?
Good in terms of transforming or transitioning, from the Bayley-3 to the Bayley-4.
Glenn, Dr. Elwood, we're struggling to hear you a little bit. Are you able to get a little bit closer to the speaker or anything? We've just had a few people commenting that they're struggling to hear.
You're having difficulty hearing me?
Yes, yeah. A few people are commenting that we're having some difficulty with the audio, and I've had a little difficulty too. So I know we tested before the session started and it was clear, but obviously it's coming through a little bit unclear now. So I don't know if you can get closer, or if you're on speaker, are you able to take it off speaker?
Let me try this.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to before we got any further.
I'm just trying to change something here.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for mentioning that the audio was challenging.
Can you hear me any better now?
That sounds better, yes.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's much better. Thanks. I'll let you carry on. Apologies for that.
Okay. Another way to compare two extant tests is to utilize the Bayley-4 and the WIPSI-4. And as you can see, the Bayley-4 corresponds to the WIPSI-4 quite well. The cognitive score on the Bayley is 99, the mean score in this group, and there were 104 children, and in the WIPSI-4 it was 103. Language on the Bayley was 100.6, whereas the verbal comprehension index was 103. The Bayley cognitive was 99, as I said before, while the visual spatial index was 100.2. Now, the Bayley-4 and Peabody Developmental Motor Scale comparisons are quite similar as well. And in fact, the Bayley motor score and the total motor score on the Peabody were identical. So now we move on to the validity. There we go. the matched group comparisons. Now what we're doing here is looking at diagnostic or discriminative validity, and we're comparing these children to matched controls. And the goal here is to establish the difference between the clinical groups and the controls so that it gives more diagnostic validity to the Bayley-4. So first, let's talk about children with Down syndrome. It is an established risk, about 1 in 600 to 1 in 700 live births, and it's probably the most common cause of mild to moderate intellectual disability. IQs typically are in the 50 to 60 range, which is mild to moderate, although they are in a continuum. Scores are higher in children with Down syndrome during infancy than they are as they get older, and this probably is reflected because of problems with expressive language in particular. Now, we had a little bit different Down syndrome population than the Bayley-3 in the sense that the Bayley-3 limited IQs to 55 to 75, whereas we took children at whatever intellectual level they were at. And here is the depiction of the data between children with Down syndrome and their matched controls. There were 54 children, and the average age was 23 months. And as you can see, the composite cognitive score was 70 in the children with Down syndrome, which is 2 standard deviations below average, while the composite of the comparative group was 103. The language composite, which is at the bottom of your screen, was 67, whereas it was 101 in the comparison group. Motor was 65, and the control group was 100. Now, you also see in the rightmost column the effect size. This is Cohen's D, which basically means we subtract the clinical group's mean score from the control group and divide that by the pooled standard deviation. In general, an effect size of 0.8 or better is considered strong, 0.5 to 0.8 moderate, and less than 0.5 weak. And as you can see here, these are quite impressive effect sizes in these comparisons. Next is children with with autism. And we recall that the CDC in 2018 came up with a figure of 1 in 59 children has an autism spectrum disorder. It's being 4 to 5 times greater in males. And if you look at DQs and IQs, 31% of the children with autism spectrum disorder have an IQ or DQ less than 70. 24% have borderline IQ DQs, which is 70 to 85, and 45% have greater than 85. The median age at diagnosis is 52 months, although it is possible at 18 to 24 months. Developmental concerns are raised in these children by 36 months in 86% of the cases. Therefore, these children are very likely to receive the Bayley-4 as part of their initial assessment. We utilize DSM-5 criteria, by the way, and we use just autism spectrum disorder, whereas in the Bayley-3 they used the 5 subtypes that were listed under pervasive developmental disorders. Okay, and as you can see in this next slide, children with autism spectrum disorder, there were 31 of them, by the way, and they were, the mean age of participation was 36 months. 24%, remember, are in the borderline group here, and you can see 72 is in that, the mean is in that borderline group where 24% of the CDC population fell. You can also see that language is the major area of deficit with a scale score, or composite scale score of 62.8 versus 97.9. And motor was also lower than we had anticipated. The next group is children with language delay. Now, inherent in the concept of delay is the issue of catch-up. And many of the children who have early language delays will catch up to peers by age 4 years. This can occur spontaneously or via intervention. Usually with language delay, comprehension is better than production. Many have the correct sequence of language milestones, but they don't do them on time. This group is highly variable, with 17% having an unknown etiology. Now, recall that in terms of language delay, the first words are spoken by about 1 year of age. Then, as the child develops, they develop 1 to 2 new words per week, and then when they hit a lexicon of 50 words, there's this dramatic acceleration in terms of language, and that occurs between 18 and 24 months. It reflects myelination of the white matter in the language pathways, and interestingly, motor neurons have a part in this. In any event, when we looked at the children with language delay, we had 25, and as you can see, the cognitive composite was average to low average, whereas expressive communication was the main area of deficit. So this finding corroborates the validity, once again, of the Bayley-4. Now, we also have children with specific language impairment. This is a little bit different in the sense that sometimes this is called a developmental language disorder. And the development of language is qualitatively different and most likely reflects a disorder versus a delay. Many of the language skills are impaired, but there is an absence of intellectual disability. In other words, the child's nonverbal cognitive abilities are in the average range, but language is a deficit. The diagnosis is made later, typically 36 to 42 months. And a fairly large proportion of these children, probably as much as 50 to 70%, have another family member with the disorder, suggesting a genetic contribution. These children have problems with verbs, use of past tense, difficulty learning new words. Carrying on a conversation is extremely difficult for these children, and these persist in probably 8 to 10%. So our sample of children with specific language impairment consisted of 25 children once again. The mean age was a little bit older than the children with language delay, which we expected. And the cognitive score here, again, was average to low average. And once again, also the expressive communication was a major area of deficit. And language, as you can see on the bottom of your screen, was the area that was most problematic for these children. Now, there wasn't as much of a difference in terms of scores between the language delay and the specific language impairment group at this time, probably because of their age. That is, the magnitude of the problem is not appreciated yet. The next group involves children with developmental delays. This is a very heterogeneous group, and they have to have developmental delays in two or more areas, which are cognitive, motor, language, social, emotional, or adaptive, and they often are qualified for EI or early childhood. These children also meet the criteria essentially for global developmental delay. Okay, so in this group, these children will differ in terms of their criteria for each state, but this is a broad cut in terms of developmental delay. And as you can see, these children score lower than their matched controls as well. There were 57 of these children. The mean age was 24 months. And as you can see, the cognitive is low, average to borderline. Language is the major area of deficit. And motor is also unexpectedly lower as well. So we thought that the motor would be a little bit higher, but as you can see, a lot of the children are identified earlier because of their motor milestones are not on target. Next, we have children with motor impairment. Now, this is a different group than what was used for the Bayley-4. These children had cerebral palsy or a developmental coordination disorder. As you're aware, cerebral palsy occurs in 1 out of 500 children, and the diagnosis is usually made between 12 and 24 months. The most severe cases can be made at 6 months or a little bit later than that. 50 to 60% of children with cerebral palsy have intellectual disability, and the greater the severity of CP, the greater the chance of the intellectual disability. Fine motor abilities are typically better than gross motor abilities. So we decided not to take all children with cerebral palsy because if it were severe, comparison of motor function to a normative group is of limited utility. So what we selected were children with mild to moderate cerebral palsy based on the gross motor function classification system of 1 to 2 is mild and 3 is moderate. So we excluded those with 4 and 5, so we don't load the comparison. In terms of the developmental coordination disorder, that is anywhere from 5 to 10% of the early childhood population, and this is a heterogeneous group who have difficulty with gross motor, fine motor, gait, postural control, catching, motor planning, and visual spatial processing. And so from this group, we then had, a comparison once again to their peers, matched peers. 40 children were involved in this sample. The median age was 26.6 months. And as you can see, significant differences were found between the motor impairment group and the control group on all subscales. The effect sizes, once again, were quite impressive as well. Now, interestingly, there was a recent article in Early Human Development in which they found that gross motor skills are associated with cognitive development because of adjacent neural pathways. In particular, the cerebellum and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are co-activated during motor and cognitive tasks. So this suggests that motor and cognitive development tend to overlap. This is why one needs to consider motor development, because that's usually an earlier manifestation than is more detailed cognitive functioning. Now we have children with prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. Alcohol and other drugs typically are used together, so it is virtually impossible to separate the individual effects of one substance or toxicant from the others because of the polydrug exposure. In addition, many children who have prenatal drug or alcohol exposure also have poor prenatal nutrition, exposure to tobacco, and poor prenatal care in general. So the children we selected reflects this population in general, and drug usage included cocaine, heroin, opioids, methamphetamine, methadone, and cannabis. In fact, cannabis is so frequent that oftentimes it's not even reported to child services anymore. In this group, we had children with fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Realize that with children having fetal alcohol syndrome, the IQ or DQ typically is in the 65 to 72 range. Now, if they don't have dysmorphic features, their IQ, DQ is in the low 80s. Most of these children show neurocognitive deficits, meaning executive function, learning, self-emotional regulation, ADHD, and problems with inhibition. So we had 44 children with prenatal drug and alcohol exposure, and cognitive was the lowest score. Motor was the best, falling in the low average range. Now realize also that these children are brought up in a less than optimum milieu a lot of times, so environment is going to have more of an impact as time goes on, unless they are in a different placement. Oops. Well, we have children born moderately or late preterm. Late preterm is 34 to 36 weeks gestational age. Moderate preterm is 32 to 33 weeks. We included children with less severe medical issues at birth, such as respiratory distress syndrome, bradycardia, apnea, grade 1 or 2 IVH, or hypobilirubinemia. It's more typical and realistic to include these children than to have children who do not have any of these comorbidities, which is actually quite rare. We did not include, however, the more significant morbidities such as intraventricular hemorrhage grade 3 or 4, periventricular leukomalacia, BPD, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or necrotizing enterocolitis. All of these have been associated with worse outcome in children, probably adding to the prematurity issue of disruption of brain development. In addition, we add in then the second part of the two-hit hypothesis, this being insult. Now, we did not include small for gestational age children, and realized that the Bayley-4 had all groups of preterms combined, and they had a limited number of very preterm or extremely preterm children. Now, what we know from the literature is that children who have been born at late preterm gestational ages, they do pretty well, but they still do less well than their full-term peers. And as you can see here, these children actually had a cognitive composite that was in the average range, although it was still significantly lower than their matched controls. Similarly, language, which is once again outlined in red in your slide, was low average, as was motor functioning. So these children, although they do more poorly than their matched controls, are not doing terribly badly, and that is encouraging. Now we have the next group, which is children born extremely or very preterm. Very preterm is 28 to 31 weeks. Extremely preterm is less than 28 weeks. There is evidence in the literature that suggests that for each week of prematurity, there is a decrease of 1.5 to 2.5 IQ points for every week less than 32 weeks. And you don't start at 100, by the way. You find the same gradient in terms of academic achievements, visual motor integration, neuropsych functions, and executive functions. And basically, there is a disruption in the brain development, but also a greater likelihood of insult or damage to the areas of the brain because they are born younger and have a longer extrauterine life, and they are subject to sensory stimuli, whether it be pain, sound, light, etc., much more early than their later born peers. So with that, we have children here who are doing more poorly than their later gestational age peers. So in other words, even though they're matched with their control group and they have an 83, which is low average to borderline, the control group has 101, they also are, these children born extremely or very preterm, also have a cognitive composite that is below their moderate to late preterm peers. And as you can see, these differences are found across the board. Interestingly, and this is found in the literature as well, expressive communication is not as bad yet at this point. It may become more of an issue when the child ages and the demands are greater in terms of expressive communication. And remember that the cognitive is 9 points lower than the moderate to late preterm. Language is 7 points lower, and motor is 11 points lower. Now, we looked at the adaptive behavior scale, and I picked here developmental delay because this is a very heterogeneous group and will give you a better idea of how the adaptive measure from the Bayley-4 works in terms of validity. And remember, we are using the Vineland 3, and there are 120 items. And we are comparing here children with developmental delay to children who are matched controls. Now, what we have, first of all, the receptive and expressive scales make up the communication scale. The personal scale makes up the daily living skills, whereas the interpersonal relations and the play and leisure functioning scales make up the overall social scale. And then we have an adaptive behavior composite, which is the ABC. And as you can see here, the communication is the lowest area, and the daily living skills and social fall in the low average range. So this is why you also want to get adaptive functioning in addition to the scales, the actual domain scores, because the adaptive functioning scores really tell you how the deficit is affecting the child's day-to-day functioning. And you will recall that in the DSM-5, there is more emphasis placed on adaptive functioning. Now, we also looked at Bayley-4 normative and clinical groups in terms of a scale score less than or equal to 4, which is minus 2 standard deviations below average. It's below the second percentile. Now, as you can see, we looked at any one scale, and we looked at cognitive language, that's expressive language, receptive language, fine motor, and gross motor. So those are the 5 scales. We did not include in this the social, emotional, or adaptive. And we found that of the comparative group, of the normative group, 10.1% had any one scale being low, being below the second percentile, or 2 standard deviations below average. Now that reflects the fact that even in the normative population, there are unidentified children with at least one area of concern. However, if you look at the clinical groups, which are below the normative group, the percentiles are much, much higher. Moreover, the normative group shows a steep decline in terms of the number of scales less than or equal to 4 once you have 2 and below, whereas a substantial number of children from the clinical groups still have a fairly high number of scales being 2 standard deviations below average. For example, so look at the children with autism, which is the second line under, and you can see that any one scale, children with autism, 80.6 or 81, essentially 81%, have any one scale that is 2 standard deviations or greater or less. Whereas if you go down to all 5 subscales, still 32% of children with autism have all 5 subscales in the problematic range. Same thing if you look at children with Down syndrome, which is DS in your leftmost column, 94%. And as you go along, even all 5 scales, 22% are still showing significant delays. The scale that is most like the comparative group, well, actually there are 2 groups that are most like the normative group, that being the language disability group, where you can see most of them are going to fall 2 scales or 1 scale below 4. And similarly, the moderate to late preterm are pretty comparable to the normative group. Now, if we look at the scales less than or equal to 7, which is 1 standard deviation, which is the 25th percentile, a fair number of the normative group is going to receive a score, at least 1 score, maybe 2, that are in the 3rd to 25th percentile. Interestingly, these are the cutoffs that are used with the Bayley screener that will be coming out as well. That is, we have high risk, which is less than or equal to the 2nd percentile. We have moderate risk, or borderline risk, which is the 3rd to 25th percentile. And then we have low risk, which is greater than the 25th percentile. And as you can see here, a lot of children are close to that 25th percentile from the normative group. So you have to keep that in mind as well. So finally, in terms of summary, all clinical groups differed from their matched controls. And the way they differed coincides with the literature and suggests that the Bayley-4 is able to distinguish these children from the normative peers. This underscores the validity of the Bayley-4 in terms of differentiating children at established, such as Down syndrome, or medical biologic risks, such as extreme prematurity, from controls. And this was accomplished with rigorously chosen clinical groups. So what I'd like to do now is open this up to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Elwood. If anybody has any questions, if you'd like to type them into the chat box. I'm just waiting to see if any come up. I think there's been a couple that have come while you were speaking. So I'll just start with those while people type in any questions. So one, this isn't related to your presentation, but I'll answer it anyway, and this is one that I can answer. There was one question about training, if people are already users of the Bayley, and do they require training to be able to use Bayley-4? And I want to answer this on here for everybody because it's not on our website yet, but there is free training online training that comes with the purchase of a kit. And we also have enhanced online training available for purchase as well, which is at $150. It should be appearing on our website this week, but I just wanted to bring that up because the question had been asked during the session, so I thought it'd be useful for everybody else to hear. So here's the first question, Dr. Elwood. Do we have any information about how the Bayley-4 compares to the Mullen scale, specifically for the ASD clinical group? I'm not sure we do, but maybe you have some comments on that.
We don't have any comparison data between the Mullen and the Bayley-4. The Mullen scales, as you are aware, are used a lot in the diagnostic workup of children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, and understandably so. I forgot to mention, by the way, that the Bayley-4 has an autism checklist incorporated in it, It's in the one of the appendices. And basically, it doesn't give you a diagnosis of autism, but it lists the different items that may have been administered that are suggestive of the possibility of autism spectrum disorder. And in general, the greater the number of these items that are ticked off, the greater the likelihood that further evaluation with an autism-specific instrument, such as the ADOS, should be used. Now, realize also that the Mullen scales were developed, but the last normative data, I believe, were 1995, so there is some concern regarding the age of the instrument.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Elwood. Okay, the next question. What are your thoughts on correcting for gestational age for very extreme or premature infants?
Well, I've looked at the Bayley-4 normative data, and it looks, and we have a paper that's been accepted provisionally at this point, and our data are very similar to those of Peter Anderson in Australia, in the sense that correction is needed probably up to 3 years in some areas. Let me give you an example. In the cognitive area, correction up to 2 years is mandatory for all gestational ages. However, correction to 3 years is necessary only in children less than 25 weeks. Now, in the language area, it looks like correction is necessary throughout the 3 years, and in terms of motor functioning, 3 years as well. Now, realize that these are preliminary data, and they need to be substantiated. So keep that in mind. I would still automatically correct to 2 years at this point, but you may want to consider the difference between corrected and uncorrected scores, and generally it goes in conjunction with the gestational age. That is, if you're 36 weeks, the need for correction is much less than if you were 27 weeks. And similarly, when you look at the correction, you have to consider that towards the end of the Bayley, we go from 1 month age bands to 3 month age bands, and you have to look to see if the child is just making the beginning of the 3 month age band, or if the child is old enough that they are up at the upper end of the 3 month age band, because then it will be less of an issue.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, another question. Clinically, I've noticed that the Bayley-3 sometimes misses children with speech or language delays. What has been done with Bayley-4 to address this?
I think we've refined the speech and language delays by combining items, by now having the separation of the child who has mastery of a particular task versus one who shows emerging skills in that task versus one who does not show any skills in that area at this time. So I think that should help in terms of differentiating children with language delays better than we previously were able to do. Hello?
Sorry, I thought I was asking a question then, Dr. Elwood. I was on mute. My error. Speaking to myself. So did the sample sizes you showed for each comparison reflect only the impaired group, for example, the Autism Spectrum Disorder group versus the typical controls? If so, was the control group similar in size or different?
They were a matched control group. So for each child that had, say, autism, we had another child from the normative group that was the same sex, the same age, and of course then the same number. So they are directly comparable.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. Okay, another one. The PDMS, the Peabody Developmental Motor Scale, was last normed in the early 2000s. Can you speak to the 19-plus year difference in the normative groups between the PDMS and the Bayley? Have you got any comments on that?
I don't recall where the PDMS, was the two was normed. So if the individual who wrote the question is aware of that, I will concede to that, of course. I just find it quite amazing that the total motor score in both was identical. And I don't think motor, actually, if you look at the Flynn effect, in terms of a meta-analysis indicated 3.45 points per decade increase in cognitive functioning, but only a 2.45 increase in motor functioning per decade. So I don't think motor functioning is as affected in terms of change over time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, another one. What kinds of factor analytic work has been done in support of the Bayley-4 scores? And this person apologises if this is covered already. They missed the first few minutes due to connection problems, but I don't think it was covered. So again, what kinds of factor analytic work has been done in the support of Bayley-4 scores?
We relied on the factor analytic work of the Bayley-3 because it was so strong, and we had the same scales now as the Bayley-3, so we did not pursue that. I think it would be a good area of further research.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we know there will obviously be a lot of research that will come out over the upcoming years on Bayley-4, as there is with any new assessment publication. So that will be an interesting piece to look out for. Okay, another question. I will answer this question because I think this is a Pearson-specific question. What is the qualification to administer the Bayley scales? So we have qualifications for purchasing the assessments. The Bayley scales is a B-level qualification. There's details on our website about the criteria to meet B-level qualification to be able to access the assessment. So it's difficult to answer any further without, there's quite a lot of criteria on the website about the qualification. So it's probably best to have a look there at what the qualification criteria are for B-level. And then the person also asks, do you require training to access it? As I said, that the qualification is linked to professional qualifications, but we do have training available, and we have the online training available that comes with the assessment, and then the enhanced training. And we also have we have an excellent team that deliver in-person trainings, whether they're half-day, full-day trainings. And so I know we have quite a few of those lined up with different groups as well. So I hope that answers that question. And then another one for you, Dr. Elwood. What percent of the reference population did each clinical group represent, and how representative is that percent of the prevalence in the general population? And what was the clinical basis for the diagnosis of the clinical groups?
Well, each clinical group, if I understand the question correctly, each clinical group was selected based on the diagnosis that included them in the clinical group. Now, some, for example, children with Down syndrome could not also have autism. Children with the prenatal exposure to drugs or alcohol could not have autism either, or Down syndrome, for example. Now, we did not base the prevalence of the disorder in terms of the number of children in each clinical group, if I'm understanding the question correctly. That would be quite an enormous undertaking. And so we tried to get representative samples of each disorder, realizing that in every case, maybe the children were not necessarily as delayed as some of the other ones. And so these are it's justifiable that there's concern that these are group data as opposed to individual. But I don't see any other way to do that in terms of time or economy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I actually think that's timed perfectly because we're just coming to the top of the hour and we have gone through all the questions. So if anybody has any last-minute questions, please type them in. I'm just going to repeat what you need to do for submitting forms for CE. So on your screen right now, you will see the instructions for ASHA CEUs, and you need to mail those forms in. The forms are attached to the invite that you had at the top of the hour. So mail those in to Darlene Davis, and the address is on the screen, and you will also get copies of these handouts as well, which will have these details in them. And we need to mail those no later than August 30th. And then for AOTA, NASP, and APA, again, no later than 8/30th. For these, you need to mail in the evaluation forms again that were attached to the invite at the top of the hour. And on that note, I think that's covered everything. We've timed that perfectly. I'd like to just thank Dr. Elwood for his insights today and the fascinating insights into the clinical groups that were used as that were part of the Bayley-4 standardization project. We do have another webinar with Dr. Elwood coming up next month, another CE webinar, so please do register for that to find out more detail on the Bayley-4. And just to thank Dr. Elwood for your time today. I don't know if you've got any closing comments.
Well, I'd just like to thank the folks who attended, and I thought the questions were quite good, and I hope we've answered a lot of them for the individuals. Thank you once again.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.